The shame was a physical thing, a stone in her belly that had been there for 5 years. Ilara felt its weight with every blast of wind that sliced through the thin wool of her cloak. Here, on the jagged edge of the Blackwood Pack's territory, she was a ghost. A cautionary tale whispered to unruly pups, the Hollow Girl. Her cabin was little more than a pile of logs leaning against a rock face, chinked with moss and mud. It was a shelter, not a home. A home was warm. A home had a pack. All she had was the cold, a constant companion that seeped into her bones and reminded her of the emptiness where her wolf should have been. Every shifter felt the wild spirit within them, a second heartbeat, a hum of power. Ilara felt only a void, a silence. On the night of her awakening, when the moon had called and her pack had gathered, something had gone wrong. The shift had torn through her, a fire without shape, a pain that promised transformation but delivered only agony, and then nothing. Her wolf had been stillborn, a flicker of a soul that had died before it could draw its first spiritual breath. They had cast her out the next day. An Omega was a low rank, but a Hollow was an abomination. A shifter with no wolf was a flaw in the goddess's design, a walking embodiment of failure. Her alpha, Lord Valerius, had pronounced her sentence with a face like carved granite. She was to live on the border, a permanent ward against their enemies, her cursed presence a better deterrent than any wall, unwanted, untouchable, unworthy. She clutched the small, smooth object in her pocket, a piece of pine she had whittled into the shape of a running wolf. It was a poor substitute for the real thing, a foolish, childish comfort, but it was all she had. She traced the tiny carved ears, her fingers raw from the cold. Sometimes, when the loneliness was a claw in her throat, she would whisper to it, telling it about the patterns of frost on her single window or the taste of the thin rabbit stew she'd managed to make. The taunts from the border patrols were the worst part. They never came close enough to touch her. Her curse was said to be contagious, but their words traveled easily on the wind. "Still talking to your twig, Hollow?" One had shouted just this morning, his laughter sharp and cruel. "Maybe if you pray hard enough, the goddess will give it splinters for teeth." She had simply turned her back, her shoulders tight, and retreated into her hut. Their mockery hurt, but it was a familiar pain, a dull ache she had learned to live with, like the cold. It was the silence inside her that was the true agony. A howl shattered the evening quiet. It was not the familiar sound of the Blackwood wolves. This was deeper, a sound that vibrated in her bones, ancient and full of a pain so profound it made her own grief feel small. It was a sound of utter desolation. Ilara froze, her hand halfway to the pot over her meager fire. That sound did not belong here. It came from the north, from the forbidden lands of the Winter King, a monarch so old and powerful he was more myth than man. No one from Blackwood dared cross that border. The stories said the trees themselves would freeze you solid. Curiosity was a luxury she couldn't afford, but the sound pulled at her. That raw, unadulterated suffering resonated with the void inside her. She felt an echo of it in her own soul. Against all reason, she pulled her cloak tighter, grabbed the sharpened stick she used for a spear, and slipped out of her hut. The snow was deep, swallowing the sound of her footsteps. The air was so cold it felt sharp in her lungs. She followed the drag marks in the snow, a wide, heavy trail marred by splatters of dark blood that steamed faintly in the frigid air. Whatever had made that sound was massive, and it was dying. She found it in a small clearing, collapsed at the base of an ancient frost-covered oak. It was a wolf, but it was like no wolf she had ever seen. It was enormous, its shoulders as high as her chest, its fur the color of silver and fresh snow. A beast of legend. Even in its wounded state, power rolled off it in palpable waves, a pressure in the air that made her want to fall to her knees. Its flank was a ruin of torn flesh and dark, clotted blood. A massive wound, black around the edges as if poisoned. Its breathing was a ragged, wet rattle, but it was the eyes that held her. They were not the eyes of a simple beast. They were a startling, pale silver, filled with an intelligence that was terrifyingly ancient. They watched her, not with aggression, but with a weary, soul-deep agony. Fear was a cold knot in her gut. This was the king's beast. She knew it with a certainty that defied logic. To be found here with it, wounded and dying, would mean her death. The Winter King was said to be merciless, a creature of ice and shadow. She should have run. She should have fled back to her miserable hut and forgotten what she saw. But she couldn't. The pain in those silver eyes was a mirror to her own. The silence of a dying wolf was a sound she knew all too well. Slowly, carefully, she knelt in the snow. She held out an empty hand, her movements small, unthreatening. "I won't hurt you," she whispered, her voice a plume of white in the air. The words were foolish, addressed to a creature that could likely snap her in two without effort, but she had to say them. The great wolf watched her. It did not growl. It did not move. It simply laid its massive head down on its paws, a gesture of profound exhaustion, of surrender. A soft whine escaped its throat, a sound of such misery that it broke something inside her. The stone of shame in her belly shifted, replaced by a fierce, aching compassion. She was hollow. She was broken. But she could not leave another being to die alone in the cold. She crept closer, her heart hammering against her ribs. The scent of pine, winter, and blood filled her senses. She reached out a trembling hand, expecting to be met with snapping teeth. Instead, her fingers brushed against the thick, silver-white fur of its brow. It was surprisingly soft, but cold. So terribly cold. The wolf closed its eyes at her touch. A shudder ran through its massive frame, not of aggression, but of something else. Relief, perhaps. It leaned into her touch. A movement so slight it was barely perceptible. It was an acceptance. A plea. And in that moment, Alara made a choice. She would not run. She would stay. She, the girl with the dead wolf, would sit with the dying beast of a king. It was a madness born of loneliness, but it felt like the first right thing she had done in 5 years. She spent the night by its side, tearing strips from her own cloak to try and clean the wound, though she knew it was a futile gesture. The flesh was corrupted, the poison too deep. All she could offer was presence. She murmured to it, the way she sometimes murmured to her wooden carving, telling it about the stars that were appearing in the indigo sky, about the silence of the snow. She offered it the only thing she had left, her company in the face of death. The great beast did not move again, but its breathing seemed to steady slightly with her voice, her hand resting on its head. It was as if her small, worthless warmth was a tiny anchor in a vast, cold sea. Dawn was breaking, painting the snow in shades of rose and gray when a shadow fell over them. Alara looked up, and her breath caught. A man stood at the edge of the clearing. He was tall, impossibly so, and broad-shouldered, wrapped in dark furs and leather that seemed to absorb the morning light. His hair was the color of midnight, stark against the pallor of his skin. His face was all harsh angles and brutal beauty, a face carved from a glacier. But it was his eyes that stole the air from her lungs. They were the same pale, piercing silver as the wolf's. He was not looking at the beast. He was looking at her hand, resting on his wolf's head. His expression was unreadable, a mask of cold control. But the power radiating from him was a physical force, a crushing weight of authority and ancient, untamed might. This was the Winter King. Kaelin, the alpha of alphas, and she was touching his soul. Fear, sharp and absolute, finally seized her. She snatched her hand back as if burned. She scrambled backward in the snow, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. He had come, and he would kill her. The king's silver eyes tracked her movement. He took a step into the clearing, the snow crunching under his boots. The sound was deafening in the silence. He still hadn't spoken. He didn't need to. His presence was a declaration of absolute power. At his approach, the great wolf lifted its head again, just an inch, and let out a low, pained whine. It was a sound directed at him, a protest. The king's gaze flickered to the beast, and for a fraction of a second something shifted in his frozen expression, a flicker of pain, so deep and sharp it was a wound in itself. Then the mask was back in place. "You," he said. His voice was not loud, but it filled the world. It was deep, like the cracking of ice on a miles-deep lake, and utterly devoid of warmth. "What have you done?" Alara couldn't find her voice. She could only shake her head, her throat tight with terror. He took another step, his gaze sweeping over the scene. He saw the tattered strips of her cloak, the small fire she'd managed to build nearby, her kneeling form in the snow. His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in something she couldn't name. Confusion. "He let you touch him," he stated. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of disbelief. The giant wolf, Lycan, whined again, a soft, pleading sound. Kaelin's gaze softened infinitesimally as it rested on the beast. He knelt beside his other half, his movements fluid and powerful. He laid a hand on the wolf's neck, and the connection between them was so potent Alara could almost see it, a shimmering cord of silver light. The king's face contorted in a brief spasm of agony as he felt the full extent of the poison, the decay. "The rot is deep," he murmured, more to himself than to her. He looked back at Alara, his silver eyes pinning her in place. "Why are you not afraid?" "I am," she whispered, the words barely audible. "Not enough," he countered. "You should have run." He paused, his gaze intense, searching. "He crawled here, into Blackwood territory. He has never done that before. He was looking for something." His eyes locked on hers. "He was looking for you." The idea was so absurd it was nonsensical. Why would this legendary creature seek out a broken, exiled girl? I don't understand." "Neither do I," the king said, and the admission seemed to cost him something. "But he is calmer with you here. The pain, it lessens when you are near." He looked from her to his dying wolf. A decision was being made in the cold calculus of his mind. "You will come with me," he said. It was not a request. It was a command that echoed with the force of his alpha will. To your fortress?" she stammered, horrified. The stories said it was a castle of black ice, a place where no warmth could survive. "You will tend to him," Kaelin continued, ignoring her fear. "My healers can do nothing for this wound. It is ancient, a curse on my bloodline, reawakened by a poisoned blade. But your presence, it soothes him. I do not know why, and I do not care. I will use any tool at my disposal to save him." A tool. That's what she was to him. It was a familiar feeling. "I have no healing skills," she said, her voice trembling. I am a hollow." She said the word like a curse, the ultimate admission of her worthlessness. Kaelin's gaze sharpened. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and she felt stripped bare, as if he could see the empty space inside her where her wolf should be. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes. It wasn't pity. It was recognition. "I am aware of what you are," he said, his voice flat. "It does not matter. You will come." He rose to his full, intimidating height. "I offer you a choice. Come to my fortress, where you will have food, shelter, and my protection. Or remain here and I will leave you to the mercy of the Alpha who cast you out. I imagine he would not be pleased to find you consorting with my beast on his land. It was no choice at all. Her life here was a slow death. With him, it might be a fast one, but it was a chance. And more than that, the thought of leaving the great wolf to suffer alone was something she could not bear. She looked at the beautiful dying beast, at the pain in its silver eyes, and nodded. I will come. The king gave a curt nod. He scooped the massive wolf into his arms with an impossible, breathtaking display of strength. The beast was immense, yet he held it as if it weighed nothing. He started walking back toward the north, not waiting to see if she would follow. He knew she would. Alara scrambled to her feet, her legs numb with cold and fear, and hurried after him. She was leaving her prison only to enter a cage of ice and shadow, a tool for a cold, merciless king. But as she followed him into the depths of the winter wood, a strange, unfamiliar feeling flickered in the void inside her. It was not hope. It was something far more fragile and terrifying. It was purpose. The fortress was not made of ice. It was carved from the black rock of the mountain itself, a grim, imposing structure that seemed to claw at the sky. Towers pierced the clouds, and banners of silver and black snapped in the relentless wind. It was a place of power and permanence, a testament to a king who had outlasted empires. Inside, it was a labyrinth of cold stone halls, warmed only by massive, roaring fires that did little to dispel the chill that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Servants and guards moved with silent efficiency, their gazes low, their faces impassive. They all looked at her with a mixture of fear and confusion. The hollow girl, brought into the heart of their kingdom by the king himself. Kaelin led her to a vast chamber, dominated by a hearth large enough for a man to stand in. On a bed of thick furs before the fire lay the great wolf, Lycan. He had not transformed back. He remained in his beast form, as if the effort of shifting was too much for him. Stay with him, Kaelin commanded, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. Do whatever it is you did before. He looked at her, his silver eyes like chips of ice. This is an arrangement, nothing more. You will be a guest in my home, but you are not one of us. Do not speak to anyone unless spoken to. Do not wander the halls. Your world is this room, and him. He made the boundaries clear. She was a necessary object, a medicine he could not explain but was forced to use. She was not a person to him. She was a function. Yes, Your Majesty, she murmured, bowing her head. He watched her for a moment longer, his expression unreadable, then turned and swept from the room, his dark cloak swirling behind him like a wing of night. The heavy wooden doors boomed shut, leaving her alone with the dying beast and the crackling fire. Alara slowly approached the fur bed. Lycan watched her, his silver eyes tracking her every move. The agony was still there, but it was muted, as if her presence was a balm. She knelt beside him, just as she had in the snow. It's just you and me now, she whispered to him. She reached out and rested her hand on his massive head. The contact sent a strange jolt through her, a faint hum of energy that was both foreign and familiar. The wolf sighed, a deep rattling sound, and rested his head on his paws, his gaze fixed on her. Days bled into a strange routine. Alara rarely left the chamber. Servants brought her food on silent feet, leaving trays by the door and scurrying away as if she carried a plague. Her world shrank to the dimensions of the room, the fire, the furs, and the wolf. She spent her hours with Lycan. She spoke to him, her voice low and soft. She told him stories she barely remembered from her childhood, tales of the moon goddess and the first wolves. She described the world outside his pain, the way the sun hit the snow, the taste of fresh water. She groomed his thick fur with a stiff brush she found, her hands working gently through the silver and white strands, avoiding the poisoned wound that refused to heal. And slowly, something began to happen. She was not healing him. The wound on his flank remained a festering horror, but the life in his eyes grew stronger. The rattling in his breath lessened. He would eat a little when she brought him broth, nudging the bowl with his nose. He was holding on. Kaelin would visit each night. He would enter without a sound, a looming shadow in the firelight. He never approached her directly. He would stand by the hearth, his arms crossed over his massive chest, and simply watch. He watched her murmur to his beast. He watched her hand stroking Lycan's fur. He watched as the great wolf followed her with his eyes whenever she moved about the room. His silence was a heavy blanket. She could feel his gaze on her, intense and analytical. He was trying to understand, trying to solve the puzzle of the hollow girl who could soothe the soul of his beast. One night she was humming a tuneless lullaby, her hand resting on Lycan's shoulder, when the king finally spoke. "Why do you do that?" His deep voice startled her. She looked up. He was closer than usual, standing just at the edge of the firs. "Do what, Your Majesty?" "Talk to him, as if he were a pup." "He is in pain," she said simply. "Sometimes a voice helps." "He is the most powerful beast on this continent," Kaelin stated, as if that negated the possibility of pain. "He has leveled armies. He does not need lullabies." Alara looked from the king's cold, hard face to the suffering in Lycan's eyes. They were the same, and yet so different. The man hid his pain behind a wall of ice. The beast could not. "His body may be strong," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But his spirit is hurting. Anyone can see that." Kaelin's jaw tightened. She had overstepped. She had presumed to understand his other half, his very soul. She braced for his anger, for the command that would send her back out into the cold. Instead, he was silent for a long moment. "No one else has ever seen it," he said, his voice so quiet she almost missed it. The admission was a crack in his frozen facade, a glimpse of the centuries of loneliness he must have endured, bonded to a beast whose pain no one else could perceive. From that night on, the dynamic shifted. His visits grew longer. He would sometimes sit in a large, throne-like chair by the fire, saying nothing, but his presence was a constant, brooding weight. She learned the subtle tells of his mood. The slight tightening of his jaw meant a difficult day in his court. The way his hand clenched on the arm of his chair meant the curse in Lycan was flaring. She began to see past the mask. She saw the exhaustion etched in the fine lines around his eyes. She saw the profound isolation of a man who ruled everything but connected with nothing. He was as hollow as she was, in his own way. His void was not from the absence of a wolf, but from the absence of feeling. Centuries of ruling, of fighting, of loss, had sealed him away from his own heart. One evening she was tending to Lycan's wound, cleaning the edges as best she could. The poison was creeping, the black veins spreading. A wave of despair washed over her. She was failing. A tear escaped and traced a cold path down her cheek. She hastily wiped it away, but not before he saw. "Your efforts are futile." Kaelin's voice came from the shadows. It was not cruel, just a statement of fact. "I know," she whispered, her voice thick. "But I have to try." He moved from his chair and came to kneel on the other side of Lycan. It was the closest he had ever been to her. She could feel the cold that seemed to radiate from his skin, a stark contrast to the fire's heat. She could smell the scent of pine and winter that clung to him. His gaze was on the terrible wound. "This was given to me 3 centuries ago, by a fey witch whose lands I conquered. She cursed my line, said my strength would become my prison, and the beast that was my power would become my slow death." He touched the edge of the wound on Lycan's flank, and his own hand trembled slightly. It has been a dormant thing, a cold ache. Until a month ago, an assassin's blade, coated in a rare poison, found its mark. It did not create the wound. It woke it up. He was telling her his history, sharing the source of his pain. It was an act of trust so unexpected it left her breathless. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why tell me?" His silver eyes met hers over the wolf's back. The firelight danced in their depths. "Because you," he said, his voice a low rumble, "are the only one who has ever looked at him and seen me." The boundary he had drawn was dissolving. The arrangement was becoming something else, something terrifying and fragile. She was no longer just a tool. She was a witness. And in the heart of the Winter King's fortress, a dangerous, impossible warmth was beginning to bloom. The arrival of the other alphas was announced by the sounding of a great horn that echoed off the mountains. It was the time of the midwinter tithe, when the lesser packs came to pay fealty to the Alpha King. Alara felt a spike of cold dread that had nothing to do with the weather. The Blackwood pack would be among them. Lord Valerius would be here. She tried to push the thought away, focusing on Lycan. The great wolf was stronger, able to stand now and pace the length of the chamber, though he was never far from her side. His wound still festered, a constant, ugly reminder of the curse, but his spirit was brighter. Sometimes he would nudge her hand with his cold nose, a gesture of affection that made her heart ache. Kaelin had ordered her to remain in the chamber. "They will not understand your presence here," he had said, his face a grim mask. "Stay out of sight." She had readily agreed, the thought of facing anyone from her past making her feel ill. For 2 days, she was safe in her sanctuary. The sounds of the fortress were different, louder, filled with the unfamiliar voices and scents of other packs. Kaelin's nightly visits were shorter, his face drawn and tight with the stress of politics and posturing. On the 3rd day, the door to her chamber was thrown open. It was not a servant. A young guard, his face pale with panic, stood in the doorway. "The king requests your presence in the great hall, my lady." Lady? The title was so foreign it sounded like a jest. "But he said I was to remain here." "Lord Valerius of Blackwood has demanded it," the guard stammered. He has made an accusation. The king has no choice." The stone of shame returned to her belly heavier than ever. It was happening. Her past had found her. Lycan sensed her distress, a low growl rumbling in his chest. He moved to stand between her and the door, a living shield of silver and white fur. "It's all right," she whispered, resting a trembling hand on his neck. "I have to go." Walking through the halls was an ordeal. The whispers followed her, the stares of the visiting pack members like physical blows. "The Hollow," she heard them hiss, "the king's pet." The great hall was a vast vaulted chamber, packed with the alphas and betas of a dozen packs. They parted before her as if she were diseased. At the far end of the hall, on a throne of black stone and silver, sat Kaelin. His face was unreadable, colder than she had ever seen it. Standing before the throne was a man she recognized with a lurch of her stomach. Lord Valerius. His hair was streaked with gray, but his face was just as hard, his eyes just as cruel, as she remembered. He turned as she approached, and a sneer twisted his lips. "So, the abomination shows itself," Valerius boomed, his voice filling the hall. "King Kaelin, for weeks my patrols have reported this creature living under your protection. I thought it a ridiculous rumor. But here she stands." Kaelin's silver eyes were fixed on her, but he addressed Valerius. "She is here at my invitation. She is a guest." "A guest?" Valerius laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "This is Alara, the Hollow of Blackwood, a shifter whose own wolf died of shame in her body before it could be born. She is a curse, a blight on the goddess's grace. By sacred law, she belongs to me. I demand you return her for purification. Purification. A cleansing by fire. He was demanding her execution in front of everyone. The assembled alphas murmured, their eyes flicking between the cold king and the furious lesser alpha. This was a challenge. She is under my protection, Kalen repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. Each word was a chip of ice. My protection is absolute. Even for a murderer? Valerius shot back, his eyes glittering with malice. A shocked silence fell over the hall. Kalen's head tilted slightly. Explain yourself, Lord Valerius. That is a heavy accusation. This wretch was not simply hollow, Valerius declared, pointing a shaking finger at Ilara. On the night of her failed awakening, another was lost. My son, my heir, Darius, was overseeing her ritual. When her shift failed, it created a backlash of rogue magic, a spiritual poison that struck him down. She killed my son. The words hit her like a physical blow. Darius? Dead? He had been there that night, his face a mixture of pity and contempt. She remembered the agony, the blackness, but nothing else. They had told her he'd been sent away for training. It was a lie. All of it. She is not just a failure. Valerius's voice dripped with venom. She is a killer who is hidden under your roof. Give her to me. Let me have justice for my boy. Every eye in the hall was on her. She was no longer just a curiosity. She was a murderer, a monster. She looked at Kalen, pleading with her eyes. She wanted to deny it, to scream that she didn't know, but her throat was closed with horror and confusion. Could it be true? Had her brokenness killed someone? The self-doubt she had lived with her entire life bloomed into agonizing certainty. She was worthless. She was a curse. She brought death to those around her. Kalen's face was a mask of stone. He was being challenged in his own hall. The laws of the packs were ancient. A criminal belonged to the pack they had wronged. To deny Valerius was to risk a war, to show weakness. He was trapped between his word to her and the stability of his kingdom. She saw the conflict in the tightening of his jaw. He had to choose. And how could he choose her, a worthless hollow, over the demands of justice and tradition? The silence stretched, thin and sharp. Ilara's world narrowed to the space between her and the throne. She saw the infinitesimal flicker in Kalen's eyes as he weighed his options. He was the king. He had to make the smart choice, the political choice. He had to give her up. The arrangement was over. The warmth was gone. Only the cold remained. She closed her eyes, waiting for the sentence to fall. No, Kalen said. The word was quiet, yet it cut through the tension in the hall like a blade. Ilara's eyes snapped open. Valerius stared, dumbfounded. What? Kalen rose slowly from his throne. He was no longer a king sitting in judgment. He was a predator unfolding to its full height. The temperature in the hall seemed to drop by 20 degrees. I said, no. He descended the steps of the dais, his movements deliberate, menacing. He did not stop until he was standing directly in front of Valerius, towering over the smaller alpha. She is mine, Kalen stated, his voice a low, possessive growl that sent shivers down Ilara's spine. Her old life is done. Her old pack has no claim. Any crime she is accused of is irrelevant. She belongs to the Winter Court now. He turned his head, and his silver eyes found hers. For the first time, in front of everyone, he let the mask slip. She saw not a king, but a man. She saw a raw, fierce protectiveness that stunned her. He was choosing her. He was choosing her over politics, over tradition, over peace. This is an outrage! Valerius sputtered, his face purpling with rage. You defy the ancient laws. I am the law here, Kalen bit out. He took another step, and now he stood beside Ilara. He reached out and, in a gesture that shocked the entire hall into silence, He placed his hand on the small of her back. His touch was a brand, a claim. "I was addressing my future queen," he said, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "Anyone who objects can take their concerns to my dungeons." Future queen. The words echoed in the stunned silence. He had not just protected her, he had elevated her. He had declared her his. Valerius's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He looked at Alara, then at Kaelin's hand on her back. He had lost. He had been publicly humiliated, but the look in his eyes promised this was not over. Suddenly, he lunged, not at Kaelin. He was too smart for that. He moved with a speed that belied his age, his hand reaching inside his tunic. He pulled out a small, dark object, a shard of obsidian, humming with a sickly green light. Blood magic. Forbidden magic. Before any of the guards could react, he slammed the shard into his own palm, hissing as his blood welled up. He began to chant in a guttural, ancient tongue, his eyes locked on Kaelin. "If I cannot have my justice," he snarled, "then your beast can have its death." Kaelin shoved Alara behind him, a furious roar building in his chest. But it was too late. The magic was unleashed. It was not a physical attack. It was a wave of vile, corrupting energy that shot across the space between them. It slammed into Kaelin, who staggered back, a choked gasp escaping his lips. He clutched at his chest, his face contorting in agony. The curse. The blood magic hadn't created a new wound. It had fed the old one. It was a catalyst, pouring gasoline on a dying fire. Kaelin fell to one knee, his body trembling violently. Frost began to creep across his skin, a rime of white spreading from his heart. His silver eyes glazed over, the light in them dimming. He was freezing from the inside out. Valerius cackled, a triumphant, insane sound. His guards, seeing their alpha's attack had succeeded, drew their weapons, moving to surround him, to protect him in the chaos. The king's own guard surged forward, but the hall was in pandemonium. Alara saw none of it. Her world had narrowed to the sight of Kaelin collapsing. She heard a howl of pure agony in her mind. Lycan. The beast was dying. The man was dying. She scrambled to his side, ignoring the shouting and the clash of steel. She fell to her knees before him, her hands hovering over his freezing skin. "Kaelin!" She cried out his name. His head lifted, his movements jerky. He looked at her, his eyes clouded with pain. "Run!" He forced the word out through chattering teeth. "Alara, run." He was telling her to save herself. But she couldn't. She wouldn't. He had just stood for her. He had just claimed her, defended her, called her his queen. She would not abandon him to this cold, dark death. Valerius's guards were pushing through the crowd, their intent clear. They were coming to finish the job, to take her. She was alone. The king was dying, and the world was turning against them. Despair washed over her, cold and absolute. It was hopeless. He was lost. She was lost. Valerius had won. She looked at Kaelin's face, at the beautiful, harsh lines now etched with a deathly frost. She saw the man who had looked past her brokenness, the man who had seen her, the man whose silent, lonely pain mirrored her own. And in that moment of absolute despair, something else rose up to meet it. Not courage, not strength. It was rage, a pure, cleansing fury at the injustice of it all, at Valerius, at her pack, at the world that had declared them both unworthy of life and love. "No," she whispered, the word a vow. "I will not let you die." She placed her hands on his chest. The cold was shocking. A deep, penetrating frost that felt like it was leeching the life from her own fingertips. She could feel his heartbeat, slow and faltering, a dying drum. She felt Lycan's spirit, a fading ember on the edge of oblivion. She thought of her own lost wolf, all the grief, all the emptiness, all the love she had never been able to give, it swelled inside her. For 5 years, that love had been a poisoned well within her. Now it had somewhere to go. She closed her eyes and poured all of it into him. Every ounce of her sorrow, her fury, her impossible, burgeoning love. She wasn't trying to perform magic. She was simply refusing to let go. She held on to his fading life with the force of her soul. A warmth sparked in her palms. It was faint at first, a tiny flicker in the vast cold. Then it grew, a steady golden heat that pushed back against the frost. It wasn't fire. It was life. Pure, undiluted life essence, flowing from her into him. A gasp rippled through the onlookers who were close enough to see. The frost on Kaylin's skin began to recede from her touch. The ice was melting. The light grew, erupting from her hands, from her heart. It was a blinding, beautiful golden radiance that filled the space around them. It was the power of summer in the heart of winter. The power of a spirit not broken, but dormant. The magic of a healer, a life-giver, sealed away by trauma and shame, now unlocked by love and defiance. The energy poured into Kaylin, not just fighting the frost, but going deeper. It found the ancient curse, the Fey witch's rot, and it burned it away like sunlight burning away mist. It found the assassin's poison and neutralized it. It found the centuries of cold sealed around his heart and shattered it. She felt Lycan's spirit roar back to life, not just healed, but whole in a way it hadn't been for centuries. She felt the bond between man and beast mend, reforged in the golden light of her power. Then, as quickly as it came, the light faded, leaving her trembling, drained, but triumphant. Kaylin's eyes flew open. The glaze was gone. They were clear, sharp, and blazing with a silver intensity that was more vibrant than ever before. He took a deep, shuddering breath, not of pain, but of life, of feeling. He looked at her, and the look in his eyes shattered her. The cold was gone. The distance was gone. For the first time, she saw him completely unguarded. She saw awe. She saw gratitude. She saw a love so fierce and absolute it was terrifying. He reached up and cupped her cheek, his hand warm against her skin. Ilara, he breathed her name. It was not a statement. It was a prayer. Then his gaze lifted, moving past her to where Valerius stood, frozen in shock and horror, his guards faltering around him. The Alpha King rose to his feet. He did not seem merely healed. He seemed reborn. Power rolled off him in waves that were no longer cold, but vital and overwhelming. You. Kaylin's voice was soft, but it carried the promise of utter annihilation. You sought to murder me in my own hall. You used forbidden magic. And you lied. Lied? Valerius stammered, taking a step back. My son. You killed my son. Did she? Kaylin asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Or did your ambitious son challenge you for the Alpha title a week before the awakening, and you, fearing his strength, broke his neck in a rage and hid his body? Did you then use the chaos of a poor girl's failed shift to create a scapegoat for your own crime? Valerius's face went white. The assembled Alphas gasped. The bond between my queen and myself is now whole, Kaylin continued, his voice resonating with power. Her light has burned away the shadows in me. I can see the truth of things with perfect clarity. I can see the rot in your soul, Valerius. I can smell your guilt. It reeks. He raised a hand, and Valerius's guards were thrown back by an invisible force, their weapons clattering on the stone floor. Kaylin closed the distance between them in a single, silent step. He placed a hand on Valerius's shoulder. For the crime of murdering your own blood, you are stripped of your rank and cast out, Kaylin pronounced. For the crime of bearing false witness against my queen, you are marked. And for the crime of attempting to kill your king. He paused. There is no forgiveness. A silver fire, the pure energy of the Alpha King's will, erupted from his hand. Valerius screamed, a short, strangled sound, before crumbling into a pile of gray ash on the floor. Silence. Absolute, terrified silence filled the great hall. Kalen turned away from the remains of his enemy as if he were nothing. His eyes sought Ilara. He walked back to her, the other alphas parting before him like the sea. He knelt before her, taking both of her hands in his. "You saved me," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "Not just my life, my soul." "I couldn't let him take you," she whispered, tears finally streaming down her face. Tears of relief, of shock, of overwhelming love. "He never could have," Kalen said, his thumb gently wiping a tear from her cheek. "My beast knew. From the moment he scented you on the wind, he knew. He wasn't crawling to a stranger's hut to die. He was crawling home." He pressed her hands to his chest, over his heart. "He knew you were the other half of my soul, my mate." He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of reverence. A kiss of homecoming. It was the sealing of a bond, a promise made in the face of death and fulfilled in a blaze of golden light. In the arms of her king, the hollow girl was finally, irrevocably, whole. 3 months later, the snow still lay thick on the peaks surrounding the fortress, but for the first time in centuries, green things were beginning to poke through the snow in the courtyard. Ilara's life-giving energy, now that it was unbound, seemed to seep into the very stones of the castle, coaxing a gentle spring into the heart of the eternal winter. She stood on a balcony overlooking the valley, a thick fur cloak, a gift from Kalen, wrapped around her shoulders. The air was still cold, but it no longer felt hostile. It felt clean, crisp, and full of promise. Arms, strong and warm, wrapped around her from behind. A chin rested on her shoulder. "What does my queen see?" Kalen's voice rumbled against her ear. She smiled, leaning back into his solid warmth. "The future," she said softly. His arms tightened. He was a different man. The ice around his heart was gone, replaced by a warmth that was reserved only for her. In council, he was still the decisive, powerful Alpha King, but with her, he was just Kalen. He smiled now. He even laughed sometimes, a deep, rumbling sound that made her heart soar. Lycan padded out onto the balcony, his massive form silent and graceful. He was completely healed, his silver and white coat gleaming with health, the cursed wound gone as if it had never been. He nudged her hand with his nose, and she threaded her fingers through the thick fur of his ruff. She had never regained her own wolf. The void was still there, a space that would never be filled. But she no longer felt hollow. Her bond with Kalen was so complete, so absolute, that she shared his. She felt Lycan's joy when he ran through the snow, his contentment as he lay before their fire, his fierce loyalty as if it were her own. They were 3 beings with 2 bodies and 1 soul. "The emissary from the Blackwood pack arrived this morning," Kalen said quietly. "They have chosen a new alpha, a good woman. She sends her fealty and her pack's profound apology. They have asked for your forgiveness." Ilara was silent for a moment, watching a hawk circle in the pale blue sky. The stone of shame was gone from her belly. The cruel words were just echoes now, powerless to hurt her. "They were afraid," she said. "And they followed a monster. They don't need my forgiveness. They need to heal." Kalen pressed a kiss to her temple. "You have a kinder heart than any queen who has ever lived." "I learned from a king who was willing to risk a war for a broken girl," she countered, turning in his arms to face him. His silver eyes, so full of love and light, gazed down at her. "There was never any risk," he said, his voice soft but absolute. "There was no choice. There was only you. There has only ever been you." He lowered his head and kissed her. A deep, lingering kiss that spoke of promises kept and a future shared. Lycan rested his head on their joined hands, a silent, powerful presence confirming the truth of their bond. She was no longer Alara the Hollow, the outcast, the abomination. She was Alara, queen of the Winterlands, the life-giver, the mate of the Alpha King. She had found her home not in a pack, but in a heart. And in the silent, snowy kingdom that had once been a prison of ice, she had finally, truly, begun to live. The world had tried to break them both, one with shame, the other with cold. But together, they had found a warmth strong enough to melt a frozen world and build a new one from the ashes.